A man in dusty boots and a faded flannel walks into a gleaming luxury car showroom. And within minutes, they're laughing behind his back. What they don't know is that the man they're mocking is the founder of the entire dealership chain. And today, he's not here to buy a car. He's here to uncover a truth. But when he hears two customers being targeted in a way that echoes his darkest fears, he stops cold. Who is really being watched? And who is setting the trap? The glass doors hissed open with a whisper as the man stepped inside, the clatter of rain tapping off his denim jacket and work boots. The lobby was all polish and pretense. Leather chairs that had never been sat in, soft jazz playing from invisible speakers, and a scent of fresh wax that screamed money. He stood out instantly. His graying beard, creased jeans, and dirt-smeared collar contrasted sharply with the sterile perfection of the showroom, where every surface gleamed like a promise. A receptionist glanced up and barely disguised the microexpression of doubt that flickered across her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, a plastic smile stretching across her lips. "I'm looking to buy," he said plainly, nodding toward a cherry-red luxury coupe parked on a turntable like a jewel. She hesitated, then gestured vaguely for him to take a seat. But no one came. Minutes ticked by. Salespeople circled other clients, laughing, pitching, closing, while the man was left to stew like an afterthought. Finally, a young salesman with slicked-back hair and oversized confidence approached. "Let me guess," he said with a smirk. "You're just browsing?" The man looked him dead in the eye. "No, I'd like to test drive that one." He pointed to the car that cost more than some houses. The salesman chuckled, then saw he wasn't joking. "We usually require a preapproval for that level of inventory." The man nodded. "That's fine. Run it." Still doubtful, the salesman guided him toward the finance desk. Along the way, they passed an ornate plaque on the wall, founded by Elijah Barrett. The man gave it a barely perceptible glance. The test drive began in silence. The salesman, still assuming this would be a quick waste of time, scrolled through his phone while the man took the wheel with a calm familiarity that didn't match his appearance. Every curve he navigated, every engine purr he summoned, hinted at someone who'd done this before. Not just driven, but built it. At one point, the man asked a question about torque distribution. The salesman stammered through an answer that clearly didn't satisfy. Still, the man said nothing. The car returned unscathed, the engine purring like a loyal dog. "So," the salesman said, smirking, "you ready to talk numbers?" The man shook his head. "I think I'll sit a little longer. Watch how you all run things." The words struck the salesman as odd, but he didn't press. Back in the lounge, the man sipped from a styrofoam cup of weak coffee and watched. He watched how older couples were treated with warmth, how younger buyers were interrogated, how a black teenager asking about used cars was passed from one salesperson to another like a hot potato. He watched a Latina mother with 2 kids get waved off after asking about financing. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. He'd built these showrooms, this brand, from nothing, and now it was showing him everything without knowing who he was. Then it happened. From the booth behind the reception desk, he heard voices. Low at first, then sharper. A man's tone carried notes of desperation. A woman, clearly pregnant, murmured something that made the man sit forward. "You said we'd get the rebate," the voice said. "Now you're saying we don't qualify?" The man's ears sharpened. The salesman's reply was clipped, cruel. "People like you always think you qualify. You don't. And don't go asking for the manager. He doesn't deal with cases like yours." The man froze mid-sip, the bitter coffee forgotten. That phrase, "people like you," rang like a gunshot in his ears. In that moment, everything changed. This wasn't just a visit. It was a reckoning. Elijah Barrett was not born into privilege, nor did his rise come from inheritance or luck. His story began in a cluttered garage on the edge of a dying Michigan town, where rusted cars lined the cracked pavement and the scent of motor oil clung to every wall. His father, a Vietnam vet and part-time mechanic, taught him how to change oil before he could ride a bike. His mother worked 2 cleaning jobs to keep the electricity on. Their love was fierce but silent, grounded in survival, and for Elijah, Every scrape of a wrench and whir of an engine was a lullaby. He wasn't just taught to fix things, he was taught to listen, to understand the heart of a machine like it was a living thing. That skill, mixed with relentless grit, carried him from under-the-table jobs to managing his first auto lot by age 26. But he didn't stop there. With every paycheck, every scraped dollar, he invested in a dream that seemed laughable to most. An honest dealership where customers weren't hustled, where dignity didn't depend on credit scores, and where every employee was treated like family. By 35, that dream had a name: Barrett Auto Group. It started as a humble used car lot on a street no one wanted to drive down, but it exploded through word of mouth alone. Elijah refused to use bait-and-switch tactics, outlawed hidden fees, and even hosted free car care clinics for single moms and veterans. In a cutthroat industry filled with sharks, he became a unicorn. One people whispered about in both admiration and skepticism. But the growth came fast, almost too fast. Investors wanted in. Franchises bloomed. Soon, there were glossy locations in every major city across the Midwest. Elijah tried to stay present, to keep his hands in the mud of his creation. But success has a way of seducing even the grounded. He shifted into an executive role, surrounded by strategy meetings, press tours, and expansion deals. The higher he climbed, the further he drifted from the showroom floor. He'd built a kingdom, yes, but slowly, brick by brick, the crown began to rust. It started with rumors, small, bitter murmurs that reached him in the form of anonymous emails and secondhand whispers. A single mother said she was denied a fair loan despite perfect payments. A disabled veteran claimed he was charged twice for a service he didn't request. One message simply said, "Elijah, they're turning your name into a lie." Each time, he launched internal reviews. Each time, the reports came back polished and clean. Customer misunderstanding, they'd say. No signs of misconduct. But Elijah knew better. He could feel it in his bones, in that old gut instinct that once told him which engine belts would snap before they made a sound. Something was off. Something was rotting from the inside. That's when he made the decision that baffled his board, his assistants, even his own family. He disappeared. For 6 months, Elijah went completely dark. No press, no meetings, no calls. He grew a beard, let his silver hair show, and wore the kind of clothes that made people underestimate him. He wanted to be invisible. He wanted the truth. Posing as a retired construction worker named Eli Barnes, he started showing up at different branches of his own empire. He played dumb, asked questions, listened. He watched how the staff treated immigrants, how they lied about warranty packages, how they pushed luxury upgrades onto families who could barely afford the base model. Some branches passed the test with flying colors. Others, they were wearing the Barrett name like a costume, none of the values, all of the profit. But none had troubled him more than the one he walked into now, his flagship store, the crown jewel of his empire. It was supposed to be the model every other location followed. It had won awards, made the most sales, hosted VIP events and charity galas. But now, sitting in the plastic lobby chair, hearing that venom-laced insult toward a struggling couple, Elijah felt something fracture deep inside. The man who once promised his dealerships would never become cold machines of exploitation realized he might have already lost that battle. And worse, he'd handed them the keys. He looked around the glimmering showroom and saw none of the values he once bled for. The kindness, the mentorship, the transparency. It had all been scrubbed away and replaced with polish and arrogance. No one recognized him, and maybe that was the point. The company no longer reflected his face, his principles, or his fire. It was hollow success. What haunted him most wasn't the betrayal of strangers. It was the thought that he had become what he once fought against. That somewhere along the way, in chasing growth and numbers, he had let weeds grow in his own garden. And now, the people hurt by that neglect weren't numbers. They were sitting just feet away, trying to buy a car they likely couldn't afford, while someone with his name on their badge made them feel smaller for trying. Elijah clenched his fists and let his knuckles whiten. This was no longer just a personal investigation. It was a reckoning. He hadn't walked in to buy a car. He had walked in to reclaim a soul, his company's and maybe his own. Elijah barely moved, but his senses sharpened like a blade the moment He heard the couple's tone shift from hopeful to hesitant. Seated just beyond the decorative frosted divider near the waiting lounge, the voices on the other side belonged to a young man and a visibly pregnant woman. Their conversation with a salesman named Chad had started polite, scripted, even. But now, something about the salesman's tone had turned oily, sliding from polite professionalism into something more sinister. Elijah could hear the undercurrent of condescension dripping from every word. "Look," Chad said, his voice a little too loud for comfort. "You've got a 540 credit score and no cosigner. You think we can just hand over keys like it's charity?" The woman replied softly, her voice quivering but respectful. "The other location said we qualified for the first-time buyer incentive." Chad snorted through his nose. "That's because they didn't run the real numbers. You people always think you're owed something." That phrase, "you people," landed like a slap. Elijah's body went rigid. His stomach tightened. It wasn't just an insult. It was a mask slipping, a glimpse into something ugly that was never meant to be seen. And it wasn't said in frustration or heat. It was calm, calculated, normalized. Elijah felt like someone had just knocked the wind out of him. The man in the booth, probably no older than 25, tried to hold his composure. "We're just trying to get something safe before the baby comes," he said, swallowing his pride with every syllable. "We don't want anything fancy." Chad laughed, leaned closer, and dropped his voice just enough to add menace. "Then maybe you should shop somewhere else. This ain't a rental lot." The woman said nothing. Elijah imagined her biting her lip to keep from crying. He'd seen that expression before, on his mother's face, when landlords questioned if she could afford the rent just by looking at her. His fists clenched again, nails digging into his palms. He looked around the dealership expecting anyone to step in. But there was no manager in sight. No co-workers intervening. A nearby receptionist pretended not to hear. This wasn't a one-time incident. This was routine, practiced, allowed. Chad continued pushing, suggesting packages they didn't need, hiking interest rates that were clearly inflated, and even suggesting they put down a deposit just to show they're serious. The young man hesitated, then asked if he could take a few minutes to talk it over with his partner. Chad's reply was a smirking shrug. "Sure, take your time. But just so you know, that deal won't last the hour. Got other buyers lined up." The intimidation was deliberate. Elijah watched as the young couple got up from the table, defeated but trying to hide it. They moved to the far corner of the lounge, speaking quietly, the woman resting a hand over her belly while the man rubbed his forehead with shaking fingers. They didn't see Elijah watching. They couldn't know who he was. But their pain, their humiliation, it was intimate, raw, and familiar. Elijah debated whether to break character. 100 times, he came close to rising from his chair, storming over and firing Chad on the spot. But something held him back, not fear but clarity. If he exploded now, they'd just say it was an isolated incident. A rogue employee. He needed more. He needed the truth to expose itself in full, not just fragments. So he waited. He watched. And then something else happened that turned discomfort into fury. Chad returned to the front desk, chatting with another salesman named Brent. Loud enough for Elijah to hear, he laughed. "Can't believe that dude thought he was walking out of here in a new car. Told him we were out of their kind of inventory welfare wagons." Brent chuckled and replied, "Bet they're looking for some handout baby mobile. Should have asked for a car seat and some food stamps with it." Elijah stood abruptly, his body humming with a kind of rage he hadn't felt in years. A few heads turned. He covered by pretending to stretch, then slowly made his way toward the finance department to give himself space to breathe. But he'd heard enough. As he walked through the hallway lined with awards, plaques, and glossy photos of community events the dealership had supposedly supported, he felt a profound disconnect. Here were the smiling faces of scholarship winners, military families receiving donated vans, even a framed letter from the mayor thanking Barrett Auto Group for its contributions. And here, in the shadows behind it all, was the cancer growing inside. Elijah's mind flashed back to his first big sale, to the moment he handed a battered truck to a single dad who cried with gratitude. That was why he built this empire, not for record profits, not for awards, but to change how people were treated when they needed something they couldn't always afford. And now that legacy was being twisted, exploited, and used to justify predation. He returned to the lounge and sat back down. The couple hadn't left yet. They were now talking to another woman, an older sales manager with a soft expression but firm posture. Elijah listened carefully as the woman gently clarified that there might be another program that could help. But before she could finish, Chad returned, cutting her off mid-sentence. "I'm handling this one, Sheila," he said sharply. Sheila narrowed her eyes but stepped back. Elijah's gaze followed the silent exchange. Even the good ones had been worn down. No one wanted a fight. No one wanted to challenge the status quo. He suddenly saw it all clearly. This wasn't about a single bad employee. It was a culture of silence. A place where profits had become the moral compass, and no one dared redirect it. Elijah reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notepad. He scribbled one line. "It starts today." He didn't know what the next hour would bring, but he knew this. He could no longer watch from the sidelines. The whisper he had heard behind the wall wasn't just a red flag. It was a siren. The fire had been lit. And now no one, not Chad, not the regional managers, not even the polished PR team, could stop what was coming. Elijah returned to his seat in the customer lounge, his mind racing with a blend of adrenaline, disgust, and betrayal that wouldn't let him sit still. The dealership he had poured his soul into had become something grotesque in his absence. And now he had seen it with his own eyes, heard it with his own ears. But he wasn't ready to blow the whistle just yet. He needed more. More proof. More rot. More faces behind the fraud. So he stayed seated, repositioning himself with the same quiet presence, the same disarming simplicity that had let him drift through unnoticed all day. Over the next 2 hours, Elijah observed patterns he could no longer dismiss as isolated. A young Indian couple, fluent in English but with accents, was steered toward used vehicles despite asking to finance new ones. A black single father was denied a loan application without explanation, only to have Elijah overhear the salesman later joking that he probably owed 3 child supports. Elijah counted 5 separate occasions where minority clients were subtly discouraged from applying for anything premium, each time redirected with excuses that didn't hold under scrutiny. Meanwhile, white buyers with lesser income or spotty credit histories were offered flexible packages and friendly smiles. The deeper Elijah listened, the more his role as observer began to twist into a kind of psychological torment. He wasn't just watching injustice, he was embedded in it, surrounded by a team who thought he was too insignificant to mind. No one recognized him, not even the older staff who had been there since the dealership's launch. That anonymity became his armor and his prison. Every time he clenched his jaw or bit back an outburst, he remembered why he was there. He thought of the young pregnant couple, now sitting in their car outside for nearly half an hour. The man was gripping the wheel with his forehead resting against it. The woman was staring out the window, her hands curled around her belly protectively. It broke Elijah in ways he hadn't expected. This wasn't just a betrayal of policy. It was a betrayal of people. Real people. People he built this empire to serve. And the cancer inside his company wasn't just policy-level indifference. It was soul-deep decay. He got up and moved through the dealership again. Slower this time, with a practiced eye. He peered into the service area and saw a mechanic arguing with a parts manager. Something about parts being double-charged on a customer's invoice. "It's just how we pad the numbers," the manager said. "Nobody checks the breakdown." Elijah scribbled that down in his notepad. Next, he wandered into the finance department where a younger employee was trying to push gap insurance on a woman who had just lost her husband. "He would have wanted you to protect his legacy," the employee said with a rehearsed sympathy that made Elijah's skin crawl. He felt nauseous, and yet he kept watching, kept listening, kept documenting. It wasn't paranoia. It was proof. The company wasn't just slipping. It had already fallen. At one point, a young Latina receptionist who couldn't have been older than 23 passed Elijah a cold bottle of water and whispered, "They're not all like that. Just be careful." He met her eyes. She recognized something in him, even if she didn't know his name. "Thanks," he said quietly. That moment lingered with him, a flicker of decency in an ocean of rot. It reminded him that not everyone inside this place was complicit, but that most had been worn down, outnumbered, or scared into silence. Elijah sat in the corner of the lobby again, but this time his mind wasn't just spinning with what he'd seen. It was calculating, planning, choosing, because what came next would not only affect the lives of the people working here, but ripple across every dealership wearing the Barrett brand across the country. Then the young couple returned. They hadn't left. They'd simply been gathering their courage. Elijah watched as they re-entered the building and approached Chad again, this time with documents in hand. "We'd like to review the financing terms you offered," the man said, more assertive now. Chad didn't like that. His eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped an octave. "You people can't just come in here and question the way we do business," he snapped, clearly forgetting or not caring how loud the showroom could get. Elijah rose halfway out of his seat, instincts screaming to intervene. But before he could, the woman, pregnant and previously quiet, stepped forward. "We know this dealership used to be different," she said. "My brother used to work for a man named Elijah Barrett. He said Barrett cared about people." That name, that moment, Elijah froze in place as every muscle in his body locked. Chad's face twisted in annoyance. "Barrett?" he said with a mocking laugh. "That old guy's a myth. A name they slap on the wall to make you feel warm and fuzzy. He doesn't even show up anymore. We run the show now." Elijah sat down slowly, his heart pounding like a drum in his ears. So they had no idea who he was. Not even a whisper of recognition. And yet, the name Barrett still held weight in the minds of customers, held hope. A hope that was now being mocked to their faces. It wasn't just offensive. It was prophetic. That line, "He doesn't even show up anymore," cut deeper than any insult could. It was the truth. He hadn't shown up. Not in years. And now, the result of that absence was here in living color. Elijah looked down at his notepad, now filled with page after page of infractions, quotes, and behavior patterns. But the decision ahead of him wasn't just about reports. It was about his soul. What would he do now that he knew the full scope of the decay? Burn it all down? Salvage what he could? Or walk away from the empire he built? These weren't business questions. They were moral ones. And whatever came next, it would demand a piece of him. Elijah watched as the young couple stood their ground, challenging Chad's dismissiveness with surprising resolve. The young man's eyes had lost their earlier shakiness. There was steel there now, hardened by humiliation and now burning with something dangerously close to defiance. "You said the rebate's gone," he said, voice low. "But we just called the regional office and they said we qualify." Chad's smile was tight, performative. "You're free to call whoever you want," he said. "But around here I make the calls. And I don't bend policy because someone whines about it." The woman beside her partner reached into her bag and produced a manila folder. "This has everything. Credit improvement statements, our bank letter, even proof of address. You said we didn't have one. You were wrong." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't flinch. Elijah shifted forward on the edge of his chair, barely breathing. Something about this moment felt off, not just because of the injustice, but because of how prepared they were. They hadn't come back begging. They'd come back ready. Chad opened the folder with forced casualness, flipping through the documents. His smirk vanished slowly, like ice melting under a blowtorch. "Where'd you get all this?" he asked. "These weren't in your file earlier." The young man didn't blink. "You never looked. You threw our paperwork in the trash when you thought we weren't looking." That detail snapped something in Elijah. He clenched his fists again, his pulse hammering. But what came next froze him solid. The woman turned her eyes, scanning the room, and then landed on him. Not just looking, searching. Their eyes locked. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She just said one sentence that shattered the illusion. "You're Elijah Barrett, aren't you?" The room collapsed inward. Chad turned in confusion. Elijah stayed frozen. The air seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What did you say?" Chad barked. The young man stepped forward, placing a steady hand on his girlfriend's back. "We know who he is," he said. "We came here for this moment, to see if the legend still exists." Elijah stood slowly, every eye in the lobby beginning to swivel toward him. The mask he'd worn all day, the silence, the slouched posture, the bland voice, melted away with every step he took forward. Chad laughed nervously. "Wait, you're not telling me. This guy's not Elijah Barrett. That guy's a millionaire recluse who lives in Aspen or some island or something." Elijah's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "I was never one for islands," he said. The silence that followed was deafening. Chad backed up a step, the cocky bravado gone like smoke in a storm. This can't be real," he mumbled. The young woman took Elijah's hand, just briefly, and whispered, "My brother worked for you 5 years ago, at the Detroit branch. He said you were the only man who ever treated him like more than a quota." Elijah nodded slowly. That name, that branch, came flooding back to him. He remembered a sharp kid named Marcus, good with numbers, even better with people. "He was let go when new management took over," she added. "He lost everything. And when he died last year, he made me promise I'd tell you what this place became." Elijah felt like he'd been struck in the chest. The floor beneath him seemed to tilt. He remembered Marcus's eager eyes, his laughter in the break room, how he used to stay late just to help older customers understand their paperwork. "Marcus was fired for being too generous," the young man said bitterly. "He wouldn't push a dons, wouldn't lie about interest rates." He said, "That's not how Mr. Barrett would want it done." Elijah's throat burned. He'd come here thinking he was the hunter, but now he realized he'd been the hunted. Not by enemies, but by consequences. And these two, they weren't random customers. They were the fallout. Living proof of what negligence, distance, and blind trust could destroy. "We're not here to sue," the woman added softly. "We're not here for revenge. We just wanted to know, are you still the man my brother believed in?" That question didn't come as a challenge. Came as a plea. One that echoed louder than any insult Chad had thrown. The entire showroom had gone still, like a theater audience holding its breath before a verdict. Staff peeked from offices. Customers froze mid-conversation. Sheila, the sales manager who had been overridden earlier, slowly emerged from the back, her eyes wide. Elijah looked around and saw what he had built, and what had been allowed to grow in its shadows. The marble floors, the glass walls, the spotless displays. All of it had become a monument to his absence. And now, the ghosts of the people he failed to protect had returned with names, faces, and truths no PR team could bury. Chad tried to regain control, sputtering, "I didn't know. Okay? I didn't know who he was." But the damage was done. Elijah turned to him, his voice low but lethal. "You didn't have to know who I was to treat people with respect." That line landed like thunder. A few people gasped. One of the porters lowered his head. The young couple didn't say another word. They simply stepped back and let Elijah stand alone in the center of the storm. This wasn't their battle anymore. They'd delivered the truth. It was up to him what came next. And though he had walked into this building as a stranger, he now stood in it as something far more dangerous. A man with nothing to lose, everything to prove, and an empire that had forgotten its king was still alive. Elijah didn't waste a second. The moment Chad stumbled backward and mumbled another weak excuse, Elijah turned his back on him. Not out of mercy, but because he was no longer worth the breath. Instead, he faced the showroom, raised his hand to his chest pocket, and pulled out a badge-shaped key fob engraved with the original Barrett auto crest. The very one used when the company had just 2 employees and a cash box stored under the front desk. He pressed it against the reception kiosk's reader, and the screen flickered, unlocking admin access. Gasps erupted as the logo on-screen morphed into something none of the staff had ever seen before. A blinking red alert that read executive presence. Level 1. It was like a silent alarm for a reckoning. Within 30 seconds, phones started ringing. The regional manager, Melissa Hart, arrived in a huff, face flushed and confused. What's going on? Why is the system? Her words died as she spotted Elijah. She knew him instantly. Her face collapsed into pale shock, her voice cracking. Mr. Barrett? Elijah gave her a look that carried decades of wear, disappointment, and decision. Clear the floor, he said. Now. Within minutes, every customer was respectfully escorted out with a gift voucher and apology. Staff who had stood silently all day now scrambled in chaos, unsure whether to run or grovel. Elijah didn't raise his voice, but his presence had shifted the air. When the showroom emptied, he stood at the center of the lobby, surrounded by the people who had once carried his legacy, and those who had buried it. Sheila stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed but eyes hopeful. Chad, deflated and visibly sweating, sat hunched in a corner chair, no longer a predator but prey. Melissa tried to speak, but Elijah raised a hand to silence her. This company was built on the promise of fairness, he began, his voice raw with fury masked in calm. Not just to customers, but to every mechanic, porter, and receptionist who believed in something better than commission-driven greed. He paused, scanning the room. I stepped away too long, and in my absence, some of you sold not just cars, but your integrity. He pulled out his notepad and began reading. Specific names, specific dates, fraudulent upselling, racist remarks, paperwork manipulation. These aren't just policy violations, he continued. They're personal betrayals, not just to me, but to every family you swindled, every customer you humiliated, and every employee you silenced. No one moved, no one interrupted. The room had become a courtroom, and Elijah was both judge and witness. Chad, he said coldly, turning to the man who now looked barely recognizable from his earlier swaggering self. You're terminated immediately. Your behavior has violated every standard this company was founded on. Chad opened his mouth, then closed it again, eyes darting toward Melissa as if she might save him. She didn't move. Melissa, Elijah added, not missing a beat. You're suspended, pending an independent review of your regional oversight. You'll step down today. Sheila will act in your place until further notice. Sheila's eyes widened. Sir, she began, but Elijah interrupted softer now. You were the only one who tried. You're not perfect, but you didn't look away. I see that. He then turned toward the rest of the staff. Everyone else here has a choice. Those who knew and stayed silent will be evaluated. Some of you may stay, most of you won't, but this place will be rebuilt, and it will remember what it once stood for. One of the porters, a teenage kid named Derek, spoke up timidly. What about the customers? They won't come back after today. Elijah looked toward the front doors, where the rain had finally stopped, and light now streamed through the windows like a quiet blessing. They'll come, he said, not for the cars, but for the truth. He then walked back to the reception desk and hit the intercom. All staff mandatory meeting in the main showroom, effective now. Within minutes, even the technicians and janitors were gathered. Elijah told them everything. About his undercover visits, about what he saw, about how far they had drifted, and about the storm of accountability that was coming. No lawyers, no scripts, just the truth. And as he finished, no one applauded. No one cheered. They simply stood, solemn and still, like witnesses to a funeral and a rebirth all at once. But Elijah wasn't finished. The couple, the real catalysts of this reckoning, were still standing off to the side, unsure whether to stay or leave. He approached them. Thank you, he said quietly, for your courage, for reminding me who I used to be. The young woman's eyes welled up. The young man gave a slight nod. We weren't sure you'd be here, he admitted. Elijah smiled for the first time that day. Neither was I. Then, in front of everyone, he turned to Sheila. Please write up a full zero-down, zero-interest financing agreement for the car they wanted, on the house, and make sure they're escorted to the hospital next month when it's time. They're not just customers. They're family now. A few people teared up. Chad stormed out, red-faced and shaking. Melissa sat down, stunned and silent. Elijah walked to the window and stared at his reflection, layered against the showroom's shining cars. He barely recognized the man staring back. But something was coming alive again. In the weeks that followed, headlines exploded. Founder goes undercover. Fires half his staff in justice purge. Barrett Auto reboots brand with integrity first model. But Elijah didn't care for headlines. He cared for people like Marcus, like Sheila, like the couple who called his bluff and lit a fire under a fallen king. He instituted new training programs, hired outside auditors, and began each week at a different branch, quiet, disguised, watching. His name no longer just hung on the wall. It walked the floors again. Some customers returned out of curiosity. Others came because they'd heard about what happened and wanted to be part of something better. And when one little boy looked up at him and said, "Are you the guy who gives cars to heroes?" Elijah knelt down and said, "No, I'm the guy who listens to them." Because that's what had been missing all along. Not profit, not growth, but listening. And once he started again, he never stopped.